Of course, well, there was no, I didn't find any meeting after the third. He was on the school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was just planning board, maybe, never ran, no.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He had a lot to say about everything. Yeah, right.
Okay, even if they're not members.
She's adamant she's going to get this, she's going to get that.
Okay, sorry about that.
She's going to get nothing.
I'm gonna get that Oh, it went right out of my mouth. I just saw it now and I went to I don't write stuff down. I can't
Well, we just have a couple of people there waiting to take their seats, I think, so we better get started. Everybody's anxious to hear Phil, I know. We want to get on the road here. So welcome, everybody. I do see some new faces out there, but I'm guessing maybe they're here. To listen to Phil's speech as much as they are about the OGS. But if anybody would like to introduce themselves, any new folks, and if you're searching for anything in particular, you're welcome to mention the name of interest. And I don't see anybody, so we shall just continue. Correspondence and announcements. The OGS conference is ready to take registrations, and it's for June 1, 2, and 3, so you can sign up and you can book your room and everything now. I got a head start. I've got it all done, so I don't have to worry about it. And the annual Petrolia Heritage Society open house is about churches and trains, and it's on February the 17th at the Petrolia Playhouse Theater from 11 till 3, so everybody's welcome. And I don't suppose anybody's here, but I do want to thank the church here for supplying this space for us every month. They are always welcome us, and we're glad to have the opportunity to be here. It's very nice. And oh yes, that's a page. Next page. The Quebec Family History Society is celebrating their 40th anniversary with Roots 2018 International Conference. And it's at McGill University in Montreal, and it's May 18, 19, and 20. I kind of wrote it just lightly on my calendar, but I don't know. And this is the major English language genealogy society in Quebec. So all presentations are in English, and the speakers, they got quite a list of speakers. You can always get more information on the website, which is www.gfhs, that's the Quebec Family History Society, at CA. Yeah, that's right. So if anybody's interested in, yes, Alan, I missed something?
Just a reminder that we have a reciprocal agreement between OGS and the Quebec Family History Society. So any OGS member can register at the member price that they have for the Quebec Family History Society.
Oh, really?
So that's a bonus.
Oh, yes, it is. Okay, thank you. So, just before I introduce Phil, I would remind everybody that to make sure you check all the minutes from the last couple of meetings, because we'll have to get those approved later on. But right now, I think the main thing we need to do is introduce our guest speaker. And of course, that's Phil Egan, and he's the author and historian, and he is a graduate of the University of Windsor and writes for several of our local newspapers. We were fortunate last September to hear Phil talk about history of Sarnia's fire department in his book, Walking Through Fire, and history of Sarnia's Bravest. So tonight he's going to discuss the milestones in Sarnia's first 50 years. So welcome, Phil. think you have to keep the microphone right up close in order to make it hear, okay, Phil?
No, you should keep it down or it gets all your breathing.
We don't want that.
Well, heavy breathing here. I'll just leave it here then. They couldn't hear me at the back before, so I'll get out of your way.
Good evening, everybody. So how's that for sound?
Good.
All right, good.
Good for you, you're right here.
So 5 days ago, Sarnia observed, I won't say celebrated because I think other than a few history buffs, nobody really noticed. Sarnia observed its 182nd birthday. Now, I think it's, I can say with some degree of pride that the Sarnia Historical Society has been able over the last 3 or 4 years to have rekindled a real interest in Sarnia's history. We've been on local television, members of our society have been on local TV probably 6 times over the last year and a half, talking about various aspects of Sarnia's history. We have meetings about 8 times a year, and I think the last meeting we had 130 came out, so we're getting great attendance at our meetings. Apparently there was one that I missed that got an even larger crowd, talking about the South Ward a few months ago. And I've been lucky enough to be able to write a weekly history column for the Sarnia Journal that I'm told people are reading and hopefully enjoying. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I had to check into a local medical facility for a routine procedure, and so I had to sit down and be processed by a young lady. And after she took all of my information, she said, "Oh, and Mr. Egan," she said, "I really enjoy reading your stories in the journal." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you very much." And she said, "Yeah," she said, "I really like all that crap." Well, I said it to my editor and said, you know, it's comments like that just make your heart swell with pride. You folks have been good enough to ask us to come out and talk to you a couple of times. I think we've talked to probably every service club in Sarnia about different aspects of Sarnia's history. We've been able to go into the schools, talking to different classes about different things. We go in and talk about the importance of Remembrance Day. Last year we had the opportunity to go into not only schools, but I think most churches in the city to talk about the importance of the upcoming Vimy Ridge 100th anniversary and why that was celebrated and why it needed to be remembered. And most importantly, we've been able to put together a massive website with probably at this point 600 or 700 stories about Sarnia's history. These were written by journalists or authors, going back in some cases to Charlotte Vidal Nisbet, who was a Sarnia historian back in the 19th century, and which we've developed as a real resource, we think, for schools, for students, or for anybody who's interested in Sarnia's history. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to go and look at the Society website, sarniahistoricalsociety.com. If you haven't had a chance to do it, please have a look, because you'll find these stories listed in categories, everything from the Amjanong to the early settlers, to business and the Chemical Valley and crime and police, the fire service, transportation, just about every category, historic churches and schools, just about every category that you can imagine is represented on the Historical Society website. Now, despite the fact that we think we've reignited some interest in the history of our city, I think it's safe to say that we probably know more about the last 100 years of Sarnia's history, or even the last 150 years, than we do about the first 50. So tonight we thought we'd take a look at some of the things that happened during Sarnia's first 50 years, and the years perhaps leading up to those first 50, that helped make Sarnia the community that it is. So as you can imagine, with doing all this writing, my books and the weekly history column, the monthly First Monday, where I think probably a half to a third of the stories that I write in First Monday have got some kind of a historical bent. As you can imagine, I spend a lot of time in the Sarnia Library. Spend a lot of time doing research. And I've, over the years, found all sorts of interesting and strange and fascinating stories in the pages of the various manifestations of the Sarnia Observer. Found stories about my dad in the early years of his business. Found actually even a story about me when I joined Great Lakes Airlines back in 1971. But I found a story about 3 or 4 months ago that really drove something home to me. And it was a story about a funeral. It was a story that was in the 1922 issue of the Canadian Observer. And it reported the funeral of a man named Joseph LaForge. Now, I knew that one of the very earliest settlers in Sarnia was a man named Joseph LaForge. But I also knew that in 1922 there was no way that he was still alive. So reading this story, it turned out that it was the story of his son, whose name was also Joseph LaForge. And he died in 1922 at the age of 90, which meant that he'd been born in 1832 here in Sarnia. And the focus of this story was that he was the first white child born in Sarnia. Now, that's not politically correct today. We'd say the first non-Indigenous. That's the way Donald Trump would say it, the first white child born in Sarnia. But in any event, the first white child born in Sarnia in 1832. And I looked through the list of his pallbearers, and I saw a familiar name, and that name was George LaForge. Now, that name was familiar to me because George LaForge was my great uncle. And I can remember when I was a teenager, Uncle George, he was actually my dad's uncle, so my great uncle, he lived in a house on Maxwell Street with 3 of my old great aunts. And I remember in the summer my dad used to send my brothers and I over to cut their grass, and in the fall to rake their leaves, and in the winter to shovel their walks. And Uncle George was pretty old in those days. This was in the early 1960s, and George was probably in his 80s or 90s then. But realizing that I knew a guy who was the first white child born in Sarnia sort of makes you realize that the earliest days of Sarnia's history are not really as far apart as sometimes we might think. And so that was something I remembered, and now it makes me look kind of old, I guess. Now I'm 70, so I'm still younger than Uncle George was in those days, but there was that connection with Sarnia's earliest days. How many know what the official motto of Ontario is? They wrote a book about it. So the motto is, "Loyal she began, loyal she remains." And while loyalty to the Crown is something that Canada is known for and Ontario is known for, that loyalty to the Crown, of course, didn't stick south of the border. And so during the American Revolution and in the years afterwards, there was a great influx of people who did not want to live under American rule. We know that when the War of 1812 came, for example, most of the Canadian militia were United Empire Loyalists, people who had left America to come and live under British rule, to continue to live under British rule. The Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution, but not all of what we think of as of the United States today was in American hands. And it wasn't until 1796 that an American army finally marched into Detroit, and the town was surrendered by the British. And when that happened, it created another influx of people who did not want to live under American rule to come up here from Michigan. And two of the families who did so in the early 19th century, like 1807 and 1809, were families that were related to each other. And they were the Parés and the Laforges, French-Canadian families. They came here and they joined another family that had just arrived not long before, and their name was Cazalet. They came from Montreal. And that name, Cazalet, later became slurred into the word Causley. And apparently the Causley name is the oldest established name in Sarnia that's still here.
9 generations.
Really?
Bob
9 generations?
Bob McCarthy said 9 generations.
Okay, that's interesting. The Ontario Genealogical Society would know that. But I thought it was
That's something I
interesting.
remember.
It's something you might know. So the Parés and the Cazalets and the Laforges, they all clustered in what is now downtown Sarnia, down by the river. And Uncle George's family, my great-great-great-uncle, had a property that ran from the river to an area that is today occupied by the Federal Building and the Sarnia Library, fittingly enough, in the amount of time I spend there. And that property was known as Laforge's Orchard. It was an apple and pear orchard. And as late as 1868, there were references to Laforge's Orchard in the writings of Charlotte Vidal Nisbet, who I've mentioned. She really had sort of the same role for the Sarnia Observer that I have for the Sarnia Journal, writing a regular history column. Now, these three families didn't own the land that they squatted on, and they were actually squatters. They rented their properties from the Chippewa band here in town. And legislation in 1763 had declared that no Indian band could lose its land without its consent and the consent of the Crown. And so at the time the Parés and the Cazalets and the Laforges all arrived here, things were starting to change. I mean, this area was a frontier. And other than the 5 little log cabins that George Durand reported finding here when he arrived from Niagara in 1833, this really was a wilderness. The area around those 5 log cabins was swamp and hardwood forest, and had no roads other than the Indian trails through the woods. People got back and forth by water, and this was the Great Highway, the St. Clair River. So, in the early part of the 19th century, there were a number of large land sales from the Indians to the Crown. And the largest of these came in the year 1827. It was a massive sale of 2,200,000 acres by Chief Wawanash and 17 other Indian chiefs. The land was so massive, I mean, it extended really from Sarnia all the way up to Waterloo. And so this initiated some changes in this area. A surveyor named Roswell Mount arrived from London and started to survey Moore and Sarnia. And as these lands were surveyed, they were put up for sale, and land grants were given, and people started to arrive. And by 1834, the 3 men who were considered the 3 founders of Sarnia were all here. And these were Richard Emmerich Vidal, who was a British sea captain, Royal Navy captain, who had been given a plot of land here in recognition for his service during the Napoleonic War. Vidal created a political dynasty that pretty well controlled the community for the next 50 years and influenced it for the next 100. Malcolm Cameron, who came here from Perth, he was already a member of the legislature. He established a fortune, although he died a pauper. He established a fortune in timber and land and shipping, and named Lambton County and built the road to London, the London Road. And George Durand, who came here, as I said, from Niagara in 1833, found these 5 log cabins. He became the first storekeeper and the first postmaster. But they were all businessmen, and they all were people who made this community thrive. In 1837, one of these significant milestones occurred when George Durand built the first mill in Sarnia. And before that, unless you were building a cabin out of logs, if you wanted to build a frame house or a frame property, you had to take your lumber across the river to have it planed to the area that was then called Black River. We still know it today as Black River, or as Port Huron was then called Desmond. So this was a big change when this facility became available here, and eventually there were lumber mills erected all over Lambton County, but the first one was the property, the mill owned by George Durand in 1837. And like I said, you know, this was a real wilderness. It was almost impossible to get around. If you wanted to go to London, for example, a distance of 60 miles, the way most people did it was to get on a boat, sail down to Detroit, cross the river to Windsor, and take a train to London. So you're covering a distance of 170 miles to get to a destination 60 miles away. It got a little better in 1840 when the first stagecoach came in, but you know, even then it was a 2-day journey by stagecoach. You know, it's funny, I was talking to a couple of grade 6 social studies classes at Rosedale School a few weeks ago, and I was telling them this story about how difficult it was to get around the area in the very early days of Sarnia's existence. And I was explaining to them that even when the stagecoaches came, it initially took them 2 days to get here. And then finally, as the London Road was built over the years 1842 to 1844 by Malcolm Cameron, got a little easier. It was then about a 14 to 18 hour trip. And I'm telling them this story, and one little guy put his hand up. And I said, yes, and he said, he stood up and he said, "What's a stagecoach?" And of course, it makes you realize, you know, the kids today, they're not watching Westerns anymore. Anyway. So as I said, the London Road was built in 1842, 1844. That made things a little bit easier. But as the town got bigger, and a lot of people started to come through then in the 1830s and 1840s, but I mean, I'm talking a lot of people, we were still a very small little village. It would be 1859 before there were 800 people here. So it was still pretty small. But business started to flourish. And it was time when money was still very cash. It was still very scarce. And so how many have heard about the Port Sarnia Syndicate? So just a couple. So you know this famous house on Maria Street, the Skilbeck House, recently got a historic designation. The Skilbeck House was the home of Robert Skilbeck. It was also the home of what was called the Port Sarnia Syndicate. And so what happened was the businessmen of the time, I'm talking 1844, would put their money together and give it to the Port Sarnia syndicate, and they would loan it out to whoever bid the highest interest rate. And that's how business flourished in those days. In fact, I mentioned in the book Walking Through Fire that it was actually a fire in the Skilbeck house in 1840 in the kitchen that prompted Richard Emmerich Vidal to call a meeting to form the Hook and Ladder Company. This was in 1840, just 4 years earlier. Now, of course, another big milestone happened in 1851 with the discovery of oil seeping up out of the gum beds in Bear Creek in Enniskillen. And, of course, this ultimately led to the founding of the North American oil industry. Now, a lot of what happened that affected this community didn't happen in our first 50 years. But with the discovery of oil in 1851, by the mid-1850s, the whole county had gone oil crazy. And there were hundreds of oil refineries, hundreds, that grew up, or were thrown up all over the county. The first one in Sarnia was the Liverpool Oil Refinery, which was on Exmouth Street. We don't know exactly where. It was either where Holmes Foundry used to be or where Norton Perry Park currently is. It didn't last very long. It was called the Liverpool Oil Refinery because it was actually shipping refined oil to Liverpool. And it was operated and owned by two of Alexander Mackenzie's brothers, Charles and John Mackenzie. He had 6 brothers, and they were involved in everything that happened in Sarnia, from oil refineries to shipping to ultimately the building of the St. Clair Tunnel. Again, outside this particular period that we're talking about, but the Mackenzie brothers obviously had an enormous impact on Sarnia in a number of different respects. Funnily enough, it wouldn't be until 1897 when Imperial Oil actually was lured here to Sarnia from London, and many don't know how that happened. The Imperial Oil was actually a conglomerate that was formed by Jake Engelhart and 18 of these small oil refiners. And they got together really to compete against the massive competition that was the Standard Oil Company in New Jersey. And Imperial Oil initially was located with refineries in Petrolia and in London, Ontario. And at some point in the late 1890s, the London refinery was hit by lightning and caught fire. And basically everybody in London said, well, good riddance. And when Imperial went to the London City Council requesting a grant of, I believe, $5,000 to build a pipeline through to the Petrolia refinery, the City Council said no. They decided that the people in London were tired of the smell and tired of the sight of the refinery. And so it was one of our more ambitious mayors, T.G. Johnson, who in 1897 lured Imperial Oil here with a 5-year tax break. And of course, that was fortuitous because eventually, of course, Imperial became the city's largest employer. So the discovery of oil was obviously a major milestone in the first 50 years. In 1852, Alexander Mackenzie, who would ultimately become Canada's second prime minister, started a newspaper that was known as, anybody know?
The Shield.
The Lambton Shield. And of course the name is still in existence today with J.D. Booth's advent. The original Lambton Shield, of course, didn't last very long. And that was because it took on Malcolm Cameron, who was at the time the most influential businessman in Sarnia, as well as a member of the legislature. It accused him of something called land jobbery, which later historians say was probably true. but you didn't make, in those days it was considered a libelous comment, and so Cameron sued Mackenzie and the Shield, and actually was given a judgment in court, and the amount of the judgment was so substantial that it literally put the Lambton Shield out of business. And the next year, Cameron actually lured a fellow named James Gammill to come to Sarnia to open another newspaper. It started off as a weekly. I think it was called the Lambton Observer and Western Advertiser, which was the original name for the Sarnia Observer. And so the Sarnia Observer started way back in 1853, as I said, originally as a weekly and then it became a daily. It had 6 different names. It was called the Canadian Observer, the Sarnia Canadian Observer, all sorts of different names. But it is, in fact, a treasure. That may sound strange coming from somebody who writes for what is effectively a competitive newspaper, but historians today in this town would not be able to do research, would not be able to write some of the books that we write without this incredible asset, which is this newspaper that has been around for such a long period, since 1853. And if you, I'm sure, you know, most of you have done research, and if you've done it at the library, you may know about the index. Is there anybody here who doesn't know about the index? The Observer Index? So you all do know about it. Okay, I won't spend any time on it then. But I mean, I didn't know about it when I started doing research, and I was surprised to find that there was such an incredible asset for researchers here, where you could literally go to any year and look up by category and find out what stories were in the newspaper that year. As well as a whole list of things you'll be familiar with, the births, deaths, and marriages that happen in the community every year. So,
Phil, we have it indexed. We have it digitized.
oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh,
Here, too.
fantastic. Sorry?
There's a copy here too in the History Center.
Oh, fantastic. Well, you know, it was a surprise to me. I, of course, can use the index, but I can't use the microfilm readers. And this is why I'm always looking for research help when, you know, when I'm doing research. I'm very fortunate now to have a number of people helping me with the book I'm currently researching, which is the history of the Sarnia Police. Got a couple of police officers and a few students helping me with that. But obviously the Observer and its index is a massive asset, and we would hate to see that asset lost. So probably the biggest change, and the thing that really broke Sarnia out of its shell as a frontier town, was the coming of the railroad. And, you know, as I said, up until that point, everybody went everywhere by water. You're traveling by roads. And even though the London Road had been built, it was still impassable much of the time. It was still a lengthy effort. And so railroads had been uniting communities in Ontario since the 1830s. But it was 1858 before a train finally arrived in Sarnia from Komoko and connected London to Sarnia. And this was the Great Western Railway. And the railway built a terminal at the foot of Cromwell Street. That's where the original train station was. And Sarnia was now connected with the rest of the world by rail. And then the following year, the Grand Trunk Railway came in from Stratford through St. Mary's to Point Edward, what was a village that was then called at the time Huron. And so this initiated even greater trade, because the railroad site, the roundhouse for the Grand Trunk, was located right under the bridge at the narrowest point of the river, and so it was a tedious project bringing cargo in and then unloading it, putting it on ferries and crossing over to Port Huron and then unloading it and putting it back on a train on the Port Huron side. A process so tedious that it ultimately led to the construction of the St. Clair Tunnel. But it really affected the growth of these communities. And it would be up until 1936 that Sarnia would still be known as primarily a railroad town when there were only 18,000 people here. For a time it looked as if Point Edward, or what would become Point Edward, might actually eclipse the size of Sarnia. But of course that was killed when the St. Clair Tunnel finally was built in the 1890s. There was a huge milestone in 1860, an event that was written about at the time as the most important event in the history of the community, and that was the visit of Queen Victoria's Queen Victoria's son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, and he was on tour of Canada and the United States. He came to Sarnia and was entertained at what was then the most magnificent hotel in the entire community, and that was the Point Edward Rail Station and Hotel. And so that was talked about as an enormous event in the history of the community. And then, of course, came the American Civil War, and when it ended in 1865, you had people of Irish descent fighting for both the North and the South, who, when the war ended, had all these weapons. And so this gave birth to the Fenian movement. And what the Fenians were, they were a group of Irishmen under a fellow named Fighting Tom Sweeney, who decided that they would give Ireland her freedom by invading Canada and holding it for ransom. And so this was a real frightening aspect in 1866. It was of such concern that there were 4,000 troops that came in and were billeted here in Sarnia. They were in tents all over town in Victoria Park. They were stationed at there were so many of them, in fact, at Hall's Hotel, which was sort of vital in Christina Street, or vital in London Road, rather. So many in that hotel that it became known as the barracks. There never was an actual invasion across the American border here from Port Huron, but there were skirmishes downriver, and there were actual invasions and fights in the Niagara area and casualties. So after 1866, the Fenian scare died out and no longer became an issue, but it was a real crisis here in Sarnia for a while. Partly because of the Fenian scare and this concern about invasion from the United States. Of course, 1867 was a Confederation year, and that was a huge celebration here in Sarnia as well as across the country. There were two massive fires that I've talked about before that so I won't dwell on them tonight, but there were two huge fires here in Sarnia in 1866 and 1867, that Confederation year, that together each wiped out half of the downtown commercial core of Sarnia. They both happened in the winter, one in November, one in January. You know, when oil lamps were out earlier and, you know, it was dark earlier. And, of course, all the buildings downtown, for the most part, were wood frame buildings. Sarnia rebuilt, but then in 1871, an event happened, not here, but in Chicago, on October the 8th, 1871, that alarmed every city in North America. And that was the Great Chicago Fire. Now, it was a massive fire. It did not start with a cow kicking over a lantern in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. This was considered an anti-Irish myth that finally in 1893, a gentleman named Michael Ahern, who was a reporter for the Chicago Republican newspaper, admitted that he had concocted. Nobody really knows what started the fire, but you can't argue about its effects. By the time the fire was over, a couple of days later, there was $170 million in damages. There were 17, and that was a massive amount of money in 1871. There were over 300 dead. There were 100,000 homeless and 17,500 buildings destroyed. And it had an effect that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but I mentioned this in the book Walking Through Fire. The thing that amazed me when I was doing the research into this history of the Sarnia Fire Department was the fact that this was not the deadliest fire on that night. In fact, the entire Midwest was in the middle of an enormous drought and gale force winds, and there were fires all across the Midwest. There was one in a place called Peshtigo, Wisconsin, that they think killed over 2,500 people. There were 200 people killed in Michigan, including 50 in fires in Port Huron. And parts of Sarnia were on fire that night. They refer to it as the night America burned. But even here in Sarnia, parts of the bush country outside the town proper were on fire. There was apparently so much smoke in the Sinclair River that a schooner and a tug collided because they couldn't see each other. So it was a calamity without any doubt. But its effect was it pretty well put an end to wooden buildings, especially downtown. And so buildings began to be constructed of brick. And the other effect it had here in Sarnia was that it created this drive to build a waterworks. So before the waterworks and before running water, people got their water in various ways. Of course, people clustered by rivers in the early days because that's where they got their water to drink and to wash their clothes and to prepare their meals and everything else. Obviously, at some point, going down to the river to get a bucket of water became something of a drudgery. And so there were people called draymen who used to go down and fill their barrels with water and sell water around town, water out of the Sinclair River. And so this was how most people got their water. Of course, you had wells, and they had cisterns, and people collected rainwater. But this drive to create a waterworks was a massive undertaking. There were only 3,000 people living here in 1871, but Sarnia wanted to build a waterworks big enough for a community of 10,000. And finally that opened in 1876, and it was a huge event here in town. People went down to what is now Veterans Park to watch a demonstration of this new waterworks. They watched the firemen come out and shoot the water cannons 200 feet into the air. There were hydrants across town now. So people had now, for the first time, effective protection from fire. But even more, what's the word? Even as important, now it was the end of the outhouses because people now had running water. They started to construct washrooms in their homes. And they also started to beautify the town. People started to build gardens. And so the community became a lot more attractive as a result of the building of the waterworks in 1876. And finally, taking us up pretty close to that 50-year timeline, was an event on November the 3rd, 1882, that was described as drawing the biggest crowds ever seen in Sarnia. And that was the launching of a steamship called the United Empire. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the United Empire. The Beatty line, which was a Sarnia steamship line, ultimately became the Northwest Transportation Company that operated the Huronic, the Hamonic, and the Noronic, the passenger steamers. One of which, the Hamonic, burned in Sarnia, the Noronic in Toronto in 1949 with a horrific loss of life. But the United Empire was the most, she was called the Queen of the Lakes. It was the most impressive steamship on the Great Lakes at the time, and drew a massive crowd. It was so famous that it wound up pictured on the Canadian $4 bill. Yeah, believe it or not, there was a $4 bill. So Sarnia's been on Canadian currency twice. Polymer in the back of the $10 bill a few years ago, as you may recall, and the steamship United Empire on the back of the $4 bill. So that's a look at some of the milestones in Sarnia's first 50 years. And thank you very much.
Got any questions? Is there any questions?
When did Point Edward become, when did they settle Point Edward?
Well, it was, I don't know the exact date, but it was in honor of the Prince Edward's visit
Oh,
in
okay.
1860. They decided to rename the community after him. So not long after his visit in 1860.
Oh, you got a couple questions there, Phil.
I can't see your hand, so
Oh, okay.
just shout them out.
Do you, Phil, do you know who it was who filed all these Sarnia observers so we can look at them?
You know,
Every time I go up there, I can't believe that somebody did that. The work they must have, who it was.
I actually don't know,
when.
but I tell you what, Dean, I think it'd be an interesting story.
They hired,
Yeah.
They had students do it.
Oh, okay. Do
And-
you know
and-
when it was?
I don't.
Alan does.
Oh, does he?
No? Well, I tell you what, they only go up to, what, 2004, I believe. So it was probably fairly recently.
Oh, okay.
They were done by volunteers, I know that.
Mhm.
You know, when we were, Kevin McCarg and I were doing the research on Walking Through Fire, we realized at a fairly early age that, like anything like that, where you have it done by volunteers, it was done with varying degrees of skill.
Uh-huh.
And so, like for example, Kevin was so convinced that there were things missing that he actually started to read through the real issues of the Observer on the microfilm. And in the second issue of the paper in 1853, in November whatever it was, 10th or 11th,
Yeah.
he actually found a record of a massive fire on the Sarnia waterfront that was not covered in the
Uh-huh.
index.
Yeah.
So, you know, that may still be something we have to look at. I know that the historical, I had no idea that you had it digitized. The Historical Society has talked about doing that.
We
If,
got permission from the library. The library owns it.
yeah, I'm
Sarnia
sure the library
owns
would be
it.
all for it.
Well, they own it, so
yeah.
we had to get their permission to
Yeah,
digitize
but
it.
I'm sure they would have.
And they were going to make it public, but they haven't done that yet, and then they were gonna allow me to put it online public, and it's been a year and a half and they haven't answered,
No,
so.
well, that's strange. You know, because it is an enormous asset.
They have a
It
copy
is.
of the digitized one there too, cause
Do
we
they?
gave it to them.
That's
That was
interesting.
part of the deal. We got to digitize it as long as we gave them
Right.
a USB stick with it, which we did.
Do you remember who you were dealing with at the library?
Well, it's Kevin that I deal with now, and he's out at Lambton headquarters, and he was dealing with, it was the head librarian in Sarnia.
Laurel?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, Laurel Van
But
Dameron?
they had people from, unemployed people doing it.
Really?
They actually were paid a little bit.
Well, I think I think, Dean, it would make an interesting story. I'll certainly look into it and see what we can find
Yes.
out about it and when
Every
it was
time I
done.
go down there, I
I'll
can't
email you
believe
what I
it's
have, Phil.
all that information.
Great. Yeah, it's massive. I should have known that everybody here would know about it. It was just such a surprise to me.
There's about
Well, me
4
too.
years that are missing.
Yes, I know there are things missing.
But
Oh,
they're
yeah,
in the
there's
Windsor
years
Star.
missing.
Yeah, there are
Sometimes
years missing, there are whole
nothing
papers
but
missing.
years, yeah.
So at some point, the Historical Society may want to take another crack at it, because it is incomplete, I know, so.
We have a list of the ones that are missing, and they are in the Windsor Star.
Oh,
We just don't have the bodies to do it, so I
Right.
can send you that.
right, interesting. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of the Lambton branch, we'd like to thank Phil again for his
you.
excellent presentation with a gift.
Oh, well,
thank you very much.
Very kind.
Did you get it? Okay.
Thanks very much, everybody.